This is Marriage to the Max, episode number 160. Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Marriage to the Max. I'm your host, Kellie Hurst, and my husband Brett and I are marriage educators and co-founders of Home Encouragement. And this podcast is designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. Well, today's episode is called Birth Order, and we have a special treat for you. Our guest on today's show is Dr. Robert V. Hurst, no relation, and he is the author of the book, Life's Fingerprint, Your Birth Order, How Birth Order Affects Your Path Throughout Life. Dr. Hurst comes to us from Covington, Louisiana. He has practiced orthodontics for over 35 years and came to his interest in birth orders by way of his young patients. He is a sought-after speaker, helping medical and business communities engage their patients and coworkers through an understanding of birth order. He's a graduate of Indiana University School of Dentistry and received his postdoctoral certificate in orthodontics from Harvard University. I recently visited with Dr. Hurst about his particular theory of birth order. I think you'll find it very interesting, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Dr. Hurst, thank you so much for joining the Marriage to the Max podcast. We're so delighted to have you today.
Delighted to be here.
Wonderful. I think this is going to be a great conversation. I think our audience is going to really enjoy learning about birth order, but also how that can relate to them as married couples and parents as well. The book was written in 2009. And it says that you had been studying birth order for about 35 years at that point. So I guess it's been about 50 years now that you've been studying this topic and writing about it. Tell us how you first got interested in how birth order shaped people.
Well, as an orthodontist, I rely on the cooperation of teenagers for my success. And I realized early in my career, when I got to see the patient for the first time, I had to make a very quick decision on how to relate to that child or adult very quickly on that first visit, and rather than wait till after I was well into treatment to find out what was going on. So I used the concept of birth order to try to understand the personalities of the different children who were many times in the same family and seemed to be very different. And the concept really looked like it was really going to work. But when I really worked with it, I found it only worked about a third of the time. And I was about ready to throw out the whole idea and try something else. But I thought, before I do that, I'm going to look into the family structures of all these patients, their brothers and sisters and whatever. And I found out that 2/3 of all my patients were separated from brothers and sisters by 4 or more years. And then it dawned on me, these were the parents that could afford orthodontic treatment because they didn't have so many children so close together. They had the resources to pay for braces. But anyway, when I looked at these children, I realized they were very different from what their ordinal birth number was. And what I found out was, because there was a 4 or more year gap, these children were kept at home and they were given the care like an only child while their older sibling was at school. So they added to their birth order the characteristics of an only child. What they do is it takes the characteristics and it amplifies them, intensifies them, and magnifies all the characteristics of their birth order when you add the only to it. So when I did that, all of a sudden, I found the Rosetta Stone of understanding everybody. Because not only did these people have double birth orders, but there was another type. When you had 2 groups of children in the same family, separated by 4 or more years, then those children picked up 2 birth orders. Let me give you an example that everyone knows. Princess Di. Did you know that Princess Di had a double birth order?
Oh.
She had two older sisters. Then there was a 4 or 5 year gap, and then Princess Di was born, and then her brother was born about 2 years later. So Princess Di was the third born, and we know the characteristics of a third born. We call them laughing on the outside, crying on the inside. They're very sensitive and they're very caring, and they see the world, they want to save the world. But then she also was the oldest one in the second family. So she became a 1-3 birth order. So she had a lot of characteristics of number one. Remember, she fought the royal family. She wanted to be in charge, and she had problems there. But she was two people. She was a 1 and a 3. And then her brother, he becomes the fourth born, but also the second in that family. So that's the other type of double birth order. So those are the two types.
That is so interesting to me. I remember being kind of fascinated by the idea of birth order, oh gosh, probably 25, 30 years ago. And I think I read a Kevin Leman book or, someone that kind of deals more in just those traditional, kind of ideas. And I remember thinking to myself, well, what about, half siblings and step siblings? And what if a sibling dies? And, it seemed like there were just so many different models and different family, setups that it couldn't possibly be just that cookie cutter, and at least in my head.
Absolutely. And one of the things in my book is I help the reader find their true birth order. And there are about 8 questions you have to answer to find your birth order. You're not just normally a 1 or a 2. For instance, the oldest one, let's say there's the older girl and then there's 4 boys. And the older girl ends up living with the grandmother because the grandmother always wanted this little girl in the house. Well, she changes her birth order. So you want to find out, first of all, who did you grow up with over those first 16 years? Who was in the family? And it makes no difference if there's steps. Everybody takes their place based on their age. And then you also want to look at, were there any illnesses in the family? Was somebody born with a handicap? That changes your birth order relationship. Of course, stepbrothers and sisters. Was there a death of a sibling when you were young? Well, then everybody has to move up. What about adopted siblings? They come in, they change the structure. And what about twins and triplets? So there's a number of things. You were absolutely right. You have to look at all these characteristics to find out the real family that you grew up in, and then you know who you really are. Mm-hmm. And then you can go from there with that real birth order.
Yeah, I love that you break it down like that. So my husband comes from a family of 6 children. There were 3 girls, and then there was about a 5.5 year gap, and then 3 boys. And my husband's the oldest of the 3 boys. But he would tell me when, we first got together, he would say, I've always felt like a firstborn. And it makes sense with your idea of, because there were so many years between his oldest sister, it was like the family order started over again with him.
That's right. So he's a 1 and a 4. Mm-hmm. And Walt Disney had the same birth order.
Really?
Yes. And I'm going to tell you somebody else who had the same birth order. Donald Trump.
That's right.
He's the oldest, and actually it's the third family because there were so many children and so many gaps. He was a 1 and a 4. So that's why he's so difficult for the press to understand, because one day they say, well, he's childlike. He's a child. Well, yeah, he is. He's number 4. And other days he's very presidential. He's number 1. Right. And that's what makes him a great negotiator, because nobody knows who he is. But if they read the book and they listened to us, they'd understand who he really is. He's 2 people.
Yeah, that's very, like very good insight. Yeah, I enjoyed your book so much. Particularly, I like how you give an example of a politician or a celebrity or a movie star or artist or something, world leader, who represents that birth order. And that I thought really made it very interesting, because just thinking about a Laura Bush or someone else, thinking, oh, right, I can see that.
Yes, what I tried to do is give the examples of all these different combinations. Let's say there's 3 children. Well, how about the first one's a boy and the next 2 are girls? And it took me a long time to find people that represented all those combinations. And there are a lot of them. But then you can start, like you said, then you can start to relate to it. And you say, yeah, that kind of is my situation. I understand that.
So you kind of unpacked a little bit about when there's 4 years, or I think you even specify in the book, particularly 4 grades of school
Yes.
between siblings, I think is how you break it down. What happens when families are bigger than 4 children?
Well, the tricks that each birth order plays and how they get the resources from the family starts all over again with number 5. Like a number 1 and a number 5 have the same characteristics, except it's like primary colors and secondary colors. It's the same color, but it's not quite as intense. Like a number 2, they're always thought of as being stubborn. Well, basically, they don't want to be told what to do. They want to protect their space. But a number 6 is a little more giving than that number 2 because he's just not quite as strong a flavor. So, and then after number 8, we start over again. Number 9 is again like a number 1, but he's in the third order, so to speak. And this lessens and smooths it out so much. So they're a little more acceptable to others and not
Yeah.
so brash.
That's so interesting. I love it. So tell us a little about the research around the birth order concept, and tell us, are there any flaws that you see in that research?
Oh, boy, you hit on a topic dear to my heart. I see so many supposedly research programs that have looked at birth order and they come up with these ideas. The problem is twofold. One, they don't recognize the double birth order. They don't recognize the spaces between children. So if they say all these number 1s or all these number 2s, well, they could be 2 onlys or 1 onlys. That's a different flavor, okay? Or they might say number 4 children. Well, in your case, your husband is a 1 and a 4. Their sample is wrong. They're making conclusions on a sample that isn't correct. And I don't know of any study that looks at the birth orders and really puts the double birth order concept in to look at their sample. If they did that, they'd see a very different outcome. And that's why some people say, birth order just doesn't work. But I'd say, well, look at my number 4. He acts like a number 1. Well, maybe he had a double birth order. What is that all about? I don't understand that. In some of the early books that were written, they just make it too simple. It's 1, 2, 3. Well, I really found it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it starts over again. So some people ended at number 3, and that's not the case. So
Yeah.
you got to be really careful when you read some of these research projects.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I grew up in a family where, so I'm the firstborn of 2 girls, but I have an older half brother from my dad's first marriage. But my older half brother did not live with us. So he would come, and visit and vacation and that sort of thing. But whenever he entered the picture, the dynamic completely changed. I mean, I was a very typical kind of firstborn girl, but then this older boy would come in, and all of a sudden I lost my my throne, when he
Oh,
would enter the picture.
that. I mean, I could tell you some stories about that, but that's exactly how birth order works. It's the interrelationship between the kids, and you weren't living with that boy. Well, when he comes into the family, all of a sudden you got demoted in birth order, and you didn't like it. I'll give you a story of a patient of mine, and in a small town, sometimes you're treating lots of families, and this little girl was an only child. Her mother was remarried, and remarried happened to be a family that I was treating and had 2 girls in the family. And so she was all excited about getting a new dad. And she told her mom, she said, well, this is going to be fun. I'm going to get some sisters and whatever. Well, when they got married, she told her mom, well, she had her own room. Don't sell the house. But anyway, they got together, and all of a sudden she went from being an only child to being a number 3. 2 older sisters. Instead of having her own room, she was sharing this room with her 2 older sisters, stepsisters. So it was 6 months later, and her mother divorced. And I saw in my practice, I saw her as a very cooperative little only child. As soon as her mother married and she became a 3, she had all kinds of problems at school, problems at home, problems. And once they got divorced, she was right back to being what she was before. So that's what happens. You don't want to get demoted. If you get promoted, it's fine. but don't make a demotion.
Well, I'm so glad you shared that story because in the work that my husband and I do with married couples, we sit with a lot of blended families as well.
Sure.
And it never ceases to amaze me how many parents don't get what you were just describing. It's not just that their kids' parents divorced, which, they didn't have any say in that typically. And so their lives got kind of uprooted and they didn't plan on it. But then also they're mixing with these new siblings. And now the birth order is all different. And, like you said, even something as simple as I had my own room before and now I've got to share with somebody. It's amazing how few parents get that and get how hard that is for kids.
Absolutely. And the kids have a lot of a bearing on how successful those marriages are going to be.
Absolutely.
They work their magic.
Yeah. So I'm curious around, since Marriage to the Max is for mostly married couples, dating couples, how do you think birth order, because I'm just a big believer that it's good for married couples to connect any dots that they can from their childhood, their life experiences, anything that has shaped us. We come into marriage and we are formed somehow. And I think one of the huge pieces of it is birth order. And it's always fun for me to ask couples that we're working with, were you a firstborn or were you a middle? Were you and it's just always a fun conversation to have. How do you think that plays out? I mean, are there ideal combinations in marriage?
Well, this is, you hit on a topic that is important to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with love at first sight. There are two types of love at first sight. The one kind is when you meet someone with the exact same birth order that you have. And why does that work? Well, you see life the same way. You can finish each other's sentences. It's just so easy. The problem is you can only have one image in the mirror at a time. Somebody has to step aside. Someone might be in charge of world affairs and someone might be in charge of domestic affairs, but you can't share the same space. But before I get into the other type of love at first sight, let me tell you that every possible combination can work, but some have more work to do than others. Okay, so all the combinations work for various reasons, but some are hard work and some are easy. One easy one is love at first sight when you meet someone with the same birth order. You just have to get out of the way of each other. The other kind of love at first sight is when you meet someone that matches the gender and the position in your family. So if you find someone, let's say you're the oldest girl and you have a younger brother. If you found a boy that had an older sister, it would match, it would mimic your childhood birth order. I've talked to thousands and thousands of people. And when I give a lecture or something and I'm asked that question, how many people have matched their childhood birth order and got divorced? I've never seen a hand go up.
Really?
And, that just doesn't happen. I mean, there's no absolutes in this world, but it just floored me. I said, now the other type of love at first sight, when the same birth order, yes, there are problems there. But the other type, they just seem to understand that person so well on both sides that they understand it and they just get along. Now, the problem there is, and you being a number one, you have a number two sister, is sibling rivalry. Sometimes number one can be dethroned by number two. And when that happens, number one is no longer a number one. And that's, of course, one of our characteristics to find out who you really are. Let's say that number one is usually the one that's better in school, and number two is usually the better athlete. They can't do the same things. They got to do different things. And I counsel some of the parents of some of my patients, and I say, look, if the kids are in athletics, make sure that one might be in soccer, but don't put the other one in soccer. Make them baseball or football or, competition's good, but not too much. So if number one is the student and number one is the athlete, then number two has no place and they just drop out. And the same thing can happen to number two. If they see number one is failing a little bit in school, they become the straight A student and they're the athlete And now number one has no special place in the family, and they can drop out. So you have to watch the sibling relationships to find out, did you dethrone? I've talked to a few people on podcasts, and one fellow, I was talking to him, happened to be in Australia, and he said, can you say that again? And I said, what? That I dethroned my older brother? Can you say that one more time? Okay.
Oh, yeah, it's a great word. I love that. When you're talking about the love at first sight, where you meet someone that's the same number as you are, that would describe. So our daughter married a guy who we adore, and they are both firstborns. And just from the very beginning, they hit it off and just absolutely loved each other. And they're very compatible and have kind of a, maybe surprisingly, since they're both number ones, they have a pretty low conflict style in their marriage relationship, but they definitely both see the world as firstborns. I mean, everything they process feels like that. So,
Right. There's no animosity there. That's true.
do you feel like there's a struggle with parents who have, let's say, a number one parent, say a mom is a number one, and maybe she's got three kids? Is it hard sometimes for her to understand that number two and number three because she can relate so well to the number one? Or
Yes, that happens. That happens all the time. And that's why they say mom relates better to the younger one and dad relates better to the older one. Well, usually it turns out that dad might be a one and mom might be a two. And so you hit on something, but when you really want to look at it carefully, you're exactly right. You are going to relate better to whatever child is your birth order. But we have to be a little tricky. It gets a little tricky here, and I'll give you a story. It happens when children have a higher birth order than their parents. One of my assistants happens to be a number 4, and her best friend, by the way, that's one of the ways you can find your best friend. It's usually your same birth order.
oh yeah,
Because you see things like, But anyway, her best friend is also a number 4, and they wanted to go to lunch one day. And they said, well, we don't know where to go. And they both have number 1 girls in school. And they said, I know. Let's check our kids out of school. They'll know where we want to go to lunch. So they did. They went to the school, they checked their girls out, and they told them where to go to lunch, and they went to lunch together. So when the kids have a higher birth order than the parents, sometimes the parents are being run by the kids.
oh, that's right.
That wouldn't happen to you. You're a number 1.
Good. So when it comes to just planning your family, let's say a couple that's just starting out together and maybe they haven't had children yet, can families use the birth order idea in planning their own family?
Sure. You have to decide if you want a number of children that are all intermixed together. They're helping each other. They're helping each other learn how to read and potty train and whatever. And those are the ones you want less than 3 years between all the children. But sometimes people say, I don't want all that, diapers all at the same time, and I want to spread that out. Well, when you do that, now you're getting individual little families. If you have a 4-year gap, you're getting a 1 only. Now, remember, you've got a very, very strong child there. And then the next child is 4 years later, that's a 2 only. So, if a 2 is stubborn, doesn't want to be told what to do, a 2 only is an immovable object. And they're tremendously strong. And then the 3 only along the line, that would be your drama queen or king, because you take the 3 and you add the only to it, and you get a very different person than just a number 3. So if you want very, very strong children, and you want to give all that energy, which you do for those 4 years in between, that's what you want to do, then that's what you're going to get. Individual little families.
Yeah.
And of course, it goes on for a long time then.
Yeah, I'm so glad you put it that way, because I think most couples think like you were describing in terms of, well, let's have them all close together so everyone's in diapers at the same time, and they think about school grades and that sort of thing. But when you think more in terms of, okay, are they going to be, true birth order, or are we going to be kind of starting a new crop at, if we put 4 or 5 years in between them? I think that's a fantastic thing to think about when you're planning. Not everyone gets to plan, when their kids arrive and so forth. But But I think that's really interesting. I'm thinking so much as you're talking. So we have three grandchildren. Our daughter has our three grandbabies, and my husband and I are very plugged into their lives. They just live 15 minutes away. And so it's girl, boy, girl. But number one and number two are Irish twins. So they're really only about 11 and a half months apart. And it was fascinating to me that when number two showed up, I don't think number one has any memory of even, any time. Well, certainly no time before number two showed up because she was still a baby. She hadn't even
Sure.
had her first birthday when he came. And then when number three came, they were still pretty close in age. But when number three came, the oldest was about to turn 3. The middle was about to turn 2. And then there was this newborn. So it was all very close together, but I appreciated you talking in the book about, when you have them really close together, that a lot of times they're not even aware that there's a baby in the house because they're still a baby themselves.
Sure. Have they taken a position, the boy and the girl? Which one's the better student and which one's the better athlete?
It's really funny because the first one, who's the girl, tends to be more athletic. So she loves dance and she's even getting into baseball and that sort of thing. Our boy so far doesn't seem to care anything about athletics. Yeah, and they're just in kindergarten and pre-K, so it's
Okay,
hard to
so,
tell exactly academically, but
well, it looks like they've taken their positions. He's taken the number one and she's taken the number two. And this happens all the time with twins. With
Mhm.
twins, even if they're identical twins, as long as you tell them which twin is older, they will take that birth order position.
Wow, that
And
is
I,
fascinating.
and you really, all children need to have a birth order. They want a place. I did have an example of twins I was treating where they didn't know who was older. And I asked the mother, I said, well, why aren't you telling the twins who's older? She said, well, we didn't want any competition between them. Well, these two girls have psychiatric problems because they had their own language, which is common with twins sometimes, but they never stopped their language. And one day, one would be the older, and one day the other would be the older. They didn't know who they were. They had no identity. Their identity was together, and that was not a good idea. That helped me understand birth order even more when I said, wait a minute, they have no birth order. They don't know who they are.
Yeah,
So they do, twins will take their order number within the family once you tell them.
that's so interesting. I imagine with all your years in your practice that you probably dealt with families that had a death of a child or, a sibling death. I know families who deal with that very differently. I know one family in particular who they lost a daughter. I believe she was age 2, and she was the firstborn. And then they ended up having 3 more children after that. And that family is very certainly talks about her. They have a birthday cake on her birthday, and it's very much not as though she's still around, but they want to make sure that they keep her memory alive and that sort of thing. What's the best way that you've seen families kind of deal with that, not just so that the parents can keep the memory of that child alive, but for the siblings as well?
I hate to use the word dangerous, but that's a dangerous thing to do to the
Really?
other. Yes, because what happens is, remember, all the children want their place, but they're also competitive with each other. You cannot be competitive of a dead sibling. That sibling was perfect in the eyes of the parents, and
Mm-hmm.
that sibling will be perfect forever. And so the number two born is trying to compete with a perfect little angel,
Hmm.
and they cannot compete with that person. And it really, really affects them throughout their life.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example of, well, it's in history, is Vincent van Gogh.
Mm-hmm.
Vincent van Gogh had a brother that was named Vincent van Gogh.
Yeah, I read that in your book. I was
Right.
so
And he was,
surprised by
he
that.
was 1 year older and he died. Then his mother named Vincent van Gogh again.
Mhm.
But she kept that other child alive with birthdays and holidays and whatever. And, Vincent didn't handle it very well. He cut off his ear and he had some psychiatric problems.
Mhm.
So it's very difficult on the other children if the parents keep that deceased sibling alive. They can mention it, but they can't be having birthday parties. And, well, your brother would be 11 years old now. That for 11 years, the other kids are hearing about this special kid that they can never compete with. So that's not a good idea.
I'm glad you gave some clarity around that, because I hadn't really thought about that as far as from the living children's perspective of trying to compete with that.
Sure.
But that's very interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. Well, tell our listeners, again, you kind of touched on this before, but I want to make sure I ask you one more time. How is your birth order book different from most that people will find out there?
Well, first of all, we're the only one that we know of that talks about double birth orders and gives you the examples of all these people with double birth orders. I had one comment when the first edition came out. It was on Amazon, and there was a comment on there that said, the lady said, "Look, I teach this concept, and I went to the bookstore and I got 10 books on birth order, but Life's Fingerprint was the only one that made any sense." She said, "I threw all the others away because this is the only one that addressed all these possibilities. The other ones are just too simple." And, sometimes if it's too simple, it is too simple. Yeah. It's not just 1, 2, 3. It's who you really are. First of all, find your real birth order. And we help the people do that in the book. And then we give the examples of all these different combinations, because we're really looking at a family structure with the birth order within it. So you got to see what's going on in the family. Like you said, a death of a child in the family, a disabled child, all these things go into finding out who you really are. And once you know who you are, you've tuned into that birth order thing that's running behind us. It's like a radio wave. It's what we do. We don't know why we're doing it, but it's influenced everything we do. Everything we do.
Yeah.
From the automobile mechanic to your doctor to whatever, they all have birth orders.
Yeah, exactly. That's so great. Well, if our listeners want to purchase the book, the title of the book is Life's Fingerprint, Your Birth Order, How Birth Order Affects Your Path Throughout Life. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I thought it was really interesting, very well done, not too, didn't feel academic. It was very, consumable. And I thought you gave some great examples, and clearly you're doing your practice for so many years. You got to see a lot of this play out right in front of you. So if people want to find you online, where can they go?
Well, they can go to, this is an easy website, www.mybirthorder.com. And that will send you to, we have lots of videos and all kinds of things. But not only do we have that book, now that you can get the hardcover book in color through our site. Otherwise, you can buy a softcover book off Amazon, but it doesn't have a section in the back which is questions that I've been given over a period of time, and I try to answer all these questions. But since that time, we've also narrated the book, so you can get a narrated copy. But we also, on our website, we have the narrated copy on a little card with a USB that you can plug into your computer. And of course, on the website too, we also have T-shirts. If you're number 1, it says "Put me in charge." You're number 2, "Don't tell me what to do." So they can find lots of information about birth order on the site.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
That's great. Well, I think our conversation today has probably been very good for if people already know about birth order, then they might go and buy this book. And maybe if they've never heard of it, they piqued their interest a little bit. And I hope they pick up the book and kind of dive in. Because as I said before, I just feel like the more dots we can connect from our childhood and upbringing to how that affects us, not just as individuals, but certainly as spouses, and parents. I think that's just so invaluable.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, if you'd like to contact us, you can find us at marriagetothemax.org. Also, follow us on social media. Well, thanks for listening today. And until next time, remember, healthy marriage, healthy world. God bless y'all.